Over the skies of northern Italy on March 23, 1944, at approximately 15,000 feet, Second Lieutenant Marcus Wheeler felt his Curtiss P-40 Warhawk shudder as the Allison V-1710 engine coughed twice and died. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the thin alpine air, while 6 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters closed the distance at 300 miles per hour. Wheeler had exactly 45 seconds before they would be in firing range, and every tactical manual he had memorized at Tuskegee Army Airfield told him he was already finished. What Wheeler could not know as his gloved hands moved across the dead controls was that his desperation and the unique circumstances of his training would combine to reveal something the most experienced combat pilots of 3 nations had somehow missed. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how a 23-year-old pilot from Georgia, confronted with certain defeat, would accidentally discover an aerial combat technique so effective that it would be studied and adapted by air forces around the world for decades to come. Marcus Wheeler had arrived at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama 16 months earlier, one of 673 cadets selected for the experimental program that would train African-American pilots for combat duty. The segregated facility at Tuskegee represented both opportunity and insult, a chance to prove capability while being forced to do so separately. Wheeler came from a family of sharecroppers outside Macon, Georgia, but he had earned a degree in mechanical engineering from Morehouse College through a combination of scholarship and working triple shifts at a textile mill. When the Army Air Forces began accepting applications for the colored pilot training program, Wheeler had seen it as the only pathway to fly that would ever be offered to someone who looked like him. The training at Tuskegee was deliberately harder than at other aviation schools. Chief Flight Instructor Charles DeBow had made it clear from day one. He had walked into the briefing room on Wheeler's first morning, a stern man with 32 years of flying experience, and addressed the assembled cadets with brutal honesty. "Your washout rate will be higher than the white training programs," DeBow had said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Not because you are less capable, but because every single one of you will be judged as representing your entire race. One failure will be used as evidence of collective inability. 10 successes will be dismissed as exceptions. Therefore, you must be exceptional, and I will accept nothing less." The facilities at Tuskegee reflected both the program's importance and the segregation that defined it. The airfield itself had been carved out of Alabama farmland, with 6 runways arranged in a pattern that allowed operations in any wind condition. The hangars were modern, equipped with the latest maintenance equipment. The classrooms featured blackboards covered with aerodynamic equations and aircraft recognition silhouettes. But the barracks for the cadets were segregated from white personnel, and the town of Tuskegee maintained strict racial boundaries that the cadets were expected to observe during their rare off-duty hours. Wheeler's class of 47 cadets began training in September 1942. They rose at 5:30 each morning for physical conditioning, running 3 miles before breakfast. The academic schedule filled the morning hours with classes in navigation, meteorology, aircraft recognition, and military protocol. Afternoons were devoted to flight training, either in the air with instructors or in ground-based simulators that tested coordination and decision-making under pressure. Evenings included additional study time and maintenance training, where cadets learned to service and repair every system on their aircraft. The washout rate was severe. Of Wheeler's original class, only 18 cadets made it through primary training. Another 4 washed out during basic training. By the time the class reached advanced training in the P-40 Warhawk, only 11 remained. The reasons for elimination varied. Some cadets struggled with the academic requirements, unable to master the complex navigation calculations or aircraft systems knowledge. Others showed adequate flying skills, but lacked the aggressive edge needed for combat flying. A few made single critical errors during check rides that demonstrated poor judgment or inadequate understanding of flight principles. Wheeler himself nearly washed out during basic training. In December 1942, during a cross-country navigation exercise, he became disoriented in clouds and temporarily lost track of his position. The instructor pilot flying with him, Lieutenant Samuel Jefferson, took control of the aircraft and guided them back to the base. After landing, Jefferson sat Wheeler down for a conversation that Wheeler would remember for the rest of his life. "You have the skills to be a good pilot," Jefferson had said, his tone serious but not unkind. "But good is not sufficient here. You need to be outstanding. When you are in those clouds and you cannot see the ground and your compass is spinning and you are not certain where you are, you cannot panic. You cannot guess. You must think systematically through the problem using everything you know about navigation, weather, and aircraft performance. Your life and potentially the lives of others will depend on your ability to solve problems under pressure." Wheeler took that lesson to heart. He spent extra hours in the navigation classroom working through problem sets until the calculations became automatic. He flew additional practice missions during his off-duty time, volunteering to accompany other students on their training flights so he could gain more experience. By the time he graduated from basic training, he had logged more hours than any other student in his class and had developed a reputation for methodical precision in flight planning and execution. The standards were merciless. Where other training programs required 40 hours of flight time before solo, Tuskegee required 60. Where others accepted a passing score of 70% on navigation exams, Tuskegee demanded 85. The mechanical comprehension tests covered not just basic flight principles, but detailed engine maintenance, fuel mixture calculations at various altitudes, and emergency procedures for scenarios most pilots would never encounter. Wheeler had watched classmates with natural flying ability wash out because they could not calculate the precise center of gravity shift when dropping external fuel tanks while in a 15-degree bank at 12,000 feet. But this exactingly thorough education had given Wheeler something invaluable. While pilots trained at standard facilities learned to fly their aircraft, Tuskegee graduates learned to understand them at a level of mechanical intimacy that bordered on instinctive. Wheeler could feel the response lag between throttle adjustment and propeller pitch change. He knew the exact sound the Allison engine made when running 15 degrees too hot. He understood how the P-40's center of gravity shifted as ammunition was expended from the wing-mounted machine guns. This knowledge, beaten into him through hundreds of hours of ground school and flight training, would prove crucial over the skies of Italy. The Tuskegee Airmen of the 99th Fighter Squadron had deployed to North Africa in April 1943, then moved to Italy that autumn to support the Allied advance up the peninsula. They flew escort missions for bomber formations, ground attack sorties against supply lines, and defensive patrols over Allied-held territory. By March 1944, the squadron had logged over 4,000 combat hours and established a reputation for staying with the bombers they were assigned to protect. Even when attacked by superior numbers of enemy fighters, the conditions in Italy during the winter and spring of 1944 were challenging for all Allied air operations. The airfields were often nothing more than bulldozed farm fields covered with pierced steel planking to provide a stable surface for aircraft operations. Maintenance had to be conducted outdoors in freezing temperatures, with mechanics working by flashlight or lantern after dark. Parts were chronically short, and aircraft were often kept flying through creative improvisation and cannibalization of damaged planes. The squadron's maintenance chief, Technical Sergeant William Hayes, had developed a legendary reputation for keeping aircraft operational with whatever materials could be scrounged or adapted from other sources. Living conditions matched the primitive state of the airfields. The pilots lived in tents, heated by small stoves that were rarely adequate against the Italian winter cold. Hot meals were irregular, depending on the availability of field kitchens and the state of the supply lines. The combination of cold, inadequate nutrition, and constant operational stress took a physical toll. Several pilots developed respiratory infections that required temporary grounding. Others dealt with exhaustion from flying multiple missions per day when the weather permitted operations. The mission tempo in March 1944 was particularly intense because Allied forces were preparing for a major offensive against the Gustav Line, a formidable German defensive position anchored on the monastery at Monte Cassino. Allied bombers flew daily missions against German supply lines, ammunition depots, and troop concentrations. The Tuskegee Airmen, flying as part of the 15th Air Force, provided escort for many of these missions. The loss rate was substantial. In the first 3 weeks of March, the 99th Fighter Squadron lost 6 aircraft and 3 pilots. 2 pilots were confirmed as prisoners. 1 was confirmed lost and the status of the others was unknown. Wheeler had arrived in Italy in January as a replacement pilot after 2 members of the squadron were lost during a mission over the Gustav Line. He had flown 28 combat missions by mid-March, most of them uneventful patrols or escorts that never encountered enemy aircraft. The Luftwaffe was increasingly conserving its fighters, husbanding resources and only engaging when circumstances seemed favorable. This made each encounter more dangerous because when German fighters did attack, they came in strength and with tactical advantage. The German pilots were experienced, often with dozens or hundreds of combat hours, and they knew how to use their aircraft's performance advantages to maximum effect. The mission briefing on the morning of March 23rd had been routine. 12 P-40s from the 99th Fighter Squadron would escort 36 B-17 bombers to an aircraft factory near Turin. The target was part of a systematic campaign to reduce German aircraft production. Intelligence estimated moderate anti-aircraft defenses and possible fighter interception, particularly during the return flight, when the bombers would be most vulnerable. The weather forecast called for clear skies over the target area, but scattered clouds over the Po River Valley. Expected flight time was 3 hours and 45 minutes. Wheeler had performed his pre-flight inspection with his usual thoroughness, checking control surfaces, fuel quantity, ammunition load, and engine condition. His assigned aircraft that day was P-40 tail number 63372, a plane with over 200 combat hours that was known among the pilots as Old Reliable for its mechanical consistency. The maintenance log showed routine service the previous day, with no outstanding issues. Wheeler signed off on the aircraft acceptance and climbed into the cockpit, running through his pre-start checklist, while the ground crew stood by with fire extinguishers ready for engine start. Wheeler had arrived in Italy in January as a replacement pilot after 2 members of the squadron were lost during a mission over the Gustav Line. He had flown 28 combat missions by mid-March, most of them uneventful patrols or escorts that never encountered enemy aircraft. The Luftwaffe was increasingly conserving its fighters, husbanding resources, and only engaging when circumstances seemed favorable. This made each encounter more dangerous, because when German fighters did attack, they came in strength and with tactical advantage. On March 23rd, Wheeler was part of a flight of 8 P-40s, escorting a formation of Boeing B-17 bombers, returning from a raid on an aircraft factory near Turin. The bombers had been savaged by anti-aircraft fire over the target, and 3 of them were struggling to maintain altitude on damaged engines. The fighter escort was spread thin, trying to cover the wounded bombers, while maintaining defensive positions around the main formation. At 14:45 hours, Wheeler's section leader, Captain Eugene Davis, reported contacts at 2 o'clock high, approximately 8 enemy fighters descending from 20,000 feet. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly. The German fighters split into 2 groups, one engaging the main escort, while the other dove on the struggling bombers. Davis ordered Wheeler and 2 other pilots to break right and intercept the bombers' attackers, while the rest of the flight maintained formation. Wheeler pushed his throttle forward, feeling the Allison engine respond as the P-40 accelerated into a climbing turn. The heavy fighter was not as nimble as the German Messerschmitts, but it was rugged and could absorb significant punishment. Wheeler had seen P-40s return to base with dozens of hits that would have downed lighter aircraft. What happened next occurred so quickly that Wheeler's first indication something was wrong came from the sudden silence. The Allison engine, which had been roaring at maximum power, simply stopped. There was no gradual loss of power, no warning vibration or temperature spike. One moment he had full thrust, the next moment nothing but the whistle of wind over the canopy and the ominous silence of a dead engine at 15,000 feet. Wheeler's training took over instantly. Mixture control, check. Magnetos, check. Fuel selector, check. Nothing responded. The propeller continued windmilling, but the engine would not restart. The physical sensation of losing power in flight is difficult to describe to someone who has never experienced it. The constant vibration and noise of the engine becomes so familiar that its absence is jarring, almost disorienting. Wheeler felt it as a physical change, a sudden lightness to the aircraft as the thrust disappeared. The P-40, heavy with its Allison engine and armored cockpit, began to decelerate immediately. The airspeed indicator needle started moving backward, 280 miles per hour, 270, 260. Each second of gliding flight bled away precious speed that Wheeler would need if he had any hope of reaching Allied lines. The tactical display around him was developing with terrible clarity. The 6 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters had been approximately 3 miles behind him when his engine quit. At their closing speed of roughly 200 miles per hour differential, they would reach firing range in just over 1 minute. Wheeler could see them clearly now, dark silhouettes against the lighter sky, growing larger with each second. The lead aircraft were already adjusting their flight paths, moving into optimal attack positions. They were splitting into 2 elements of 3 aircraft each, a standard German tactic that would allow them to attack from multiple angles and prevent their target from evading both groups simultaneously. Protocol for engine failure in combat was explicit. A pilot without power was defenseless and should immediately dive for speed and seek the safety of Allied lines, or prepare to bail out if over enemy territory. But Wheeler was over the Po River Valley, 35 miles behind German lines. Bailing out meant either capture or spending months trying to link up with partisan groups while avoiding German patrols. More immediately, 6 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters had spotted his powerless aircraft and were turning toward him like wolves sensing wounded prey. Wheeler ran the numbers in his head: 35 miles to Allied lines, current altitude 15,000 feet, losing altitude at roughly 800 feet per minute in his unpowered glide. That gave him approximately 19 minutes of flight time before he would be forced to land or bail out, but he would be under attack in less than 60 seconds. The P-40's glide ratio was approximately 10-1, meaning it would travel forward 10 feet for every foot of altitude lost. From 15,000 feet, the maximum theoretical range was approximately 28 miles. But that assumed no maneuvering, no defensive actions, and optimal glide speed. Any turn, any defensive maneuver, would increase drag and reduce range. Wheeler was looking at a mathematical impossibility. He could not reach Allied lines without power, and he could not defend himself without maneuvering. Every defensive action would cost him range, making his ultimate situation worse even if he survived the immediate attack. The Bf-109 was, in most respects, superior to the P-40 Warhawk. The German fighter was faster, climbed better, and had better high-altitude performance. The latest Bf-109 Gustav model, which Wheeler believed he was facing based on their silhouettes, could reach speeds of over 400 miles per hour and climb at over 4,000 feet per minute. They were armed with one 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm machine guns mounted above the engine. The combination of speed, climb rate, and firepower made the Bf-109 one of the most effective fighters in the German infantry. The P-40's advantages were ruggedness, diving speed, and low-altitude maneuverability. But all of those advantages required engine power, which Wheeler no longer had. He was gliding, trading altitude for airspeed, with 6 enemy fighters closing and no way to fight back. Wheeler's mind raced through options with the systematic precision that had been drilled into him at Tuskegee. Option 1, continue gliding toward Allied lines and hope the German fighters would break off before using all their ammunition. Probability of success nearly 0. Option 2, bail out immediately and become a prisoner. Probability of survival high, but probability of ever flying again 0. Option 3, attempt to restart the engine while evading the fighters. Probability of success unknown but very low. Option 4, something else, something not in the manual, something the German pilots would not expect. But what? He could not outrun them, he could not fight them. He had perhaps 90 seconds before the first German pilot would be in firing range. The nearest Allied positions were 35 miles away, and he was losing altitude at approximately 800 feet per minute. Basic mathematics told him he would be on the ground one way or another in less than 20 minutes, but he would be under fire in less than 2. Wheeler's hands moved across the controls, not following any procedure but simply maintaining feel of the aircraft. The stick moved slightly in his hand, the ailerons responding to air pressure even without engine power. The rudder pedals still provided directional control. He still had an aircraft, even if he did not have an engine. That meant he still had options, even if none of them were in any manual he had read. The Bf-109 was, in most respects, superior to the P-40 Warhawk. The German fighter was faster, climbed better, and had better high-altitude performance. The P-40's advantages were ruggedness, diving speed, and low-altitude maneuverability. But all of those advantages required engine power, which Wheeler no longer had. He was gliding, trading altitude for airspeed, with 6 enemy fighters closing and no way to fight back. Wheeler's mind raced through options. He could not outrun them. He could not fight them. He had perhaps 90 seconds before the first German pilot would be in firing range. The nearest Allied positions were 35 miles away, and he was losing altitude at approximately 800 feet per minute. Basic mathematics told him he would be on the ground, one way or another, in less than 20 minutes, but he would be under fire in less than 2. Then Wheeler remembered something from his engineering courses at Morehouse, a lecture on fluid dynamics and the behavior of airfoils at different angles of attack. The professor, Dr. Raymond Harris, had been discussing stall characteristics of various wing designs. An aircraft stalls when the angle of attack, the angle between the wing and the oncoming air, becomes too steep and airflow separates from the upper wing surface. This causes a sudden loss of lift. Most pilots were taught to fear stalls because they could lead to spins and loss of control. But Dr. Harris had mentioned something else, something about intentional stalls being used in aerobatic demonstrations to rapidly change an aircraft's attitude. Harris had showed a film of a stunt pilot at an air show performing what he called a hammerhead stall, where the aircraft climbed vertically until it ran out of airspeed, stalled, and fell nose down in the opposite direction. The memory crystallized into an idea. Wheeler had no tactical options within conventional combat maneuvering, but what if he stepped outside those conventions entirely? What if he used physics instead of tactics? The Messerschmitt pilots were closing from behind and above, the classic bounce position. They expected him to continue his glide, trying to stretch his range toward Allied lines. They would close steadily, line up their shots and open fire at optimal range. Their entire attack plan was based on predictable behavior from their target. But predictability was only required if you were playing by the same rules. What if Wheeler changed the rules entirely? What Wheeler conceived in that moment was not tactics but physics. He had an aircraft with control authority. He had altitude to trade. He had airspeed, though it was decreasing. Those were resources he could spend, and spending them in an unexpected way might buy him something more valuable, time and positional advantage. The standard energy management principles said, never waste altitude without a corresponding gain in position or speed. But those principles assumed you had the luxury of following standard practices. Wheeler did not have that luxury. He had desperation, and desperation could be its own kind of resource if used creatively. The physics were straightforward. If he pulled the aircraft into a steep climb, he would trade his remaining forward speed for vertical altitude. The P-40 would zoom upward, rising perhaps another 2,000 feet before running completely out of airspeed. At that point, the aircraft would stall and fall. Most stalls were dangerous because they occurred inadvertently when a pilot was trying to maintain controlled flight. But an intentional stall, one that was anticipated and prepared for, could potentially be controlled. And if Wheeler could control the stall, he could control where the aircraft's nose pointed when it fell. If he could point the nose back toward the attacking fighters, even briefly, he would transform a defensive glide into something approximating an offensive position. It would not give him the ability to actually attack, not without engine power, but it might disrupt their attack geometry enough to buy additional seconds. And seconds were all he had left to work with. Wheeler eased his control stick back, raising the nose of the P-40. The airspeed indicator began dropping rapidly as the heavy fighter pitched up. The aircraft was now climbing, despite having no power, converting its forward speed into altitude. The rate of climb was entirely unsustainable, bleeding airspeed at an alarming rate. But Wheeler kept pulling. The P-40's nose came up 20 degrees, 30 degrees, 45 degrees above the horizon. The airspeed dropped through 120 miles per hour, then 100, then 80. The controls went mushy as the aircraft approached stall speed. Behind him, the lead Messerschmitt pilot, Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann of Jagdgeschwader 53, watched with confusion. Hartmann had over 60 confirmed victories and had seen countless pilots try desperate maneuvers when caught without options. But this made no tactical sense. The American was throwing away his airspeed, his only remaining asset. Hartmann eased his throttle back slightly, not wanting to overshoot his target. The rest of his flight followed his lead, slowing to match the American's decreasing speed. Wheeler felt the stall before the warning horn sounded. The stick went completely soft in his hand, and the P-40 shuddered. The nose dropped despite his back pressure on the stick, and the aircraft fell sideways into what would normally be the beginning of a deadly spin. But Wheeler had anticipated this. As the nose dropped, he simultaneously pushed full right rudder and rolled the stick to the left. The P-40, already in a stall, snapped violently into an inverted spin, flipping completely over in less than 2 seconds. The result was spectacular and completely unexpected. The heavy fighter, which a moment before had been flying straight and level, suddenly rotated 180 degrees in both pitch and roll simultaneously. To the German pilots behind him, it appeared as though the American's aircraft had exploded or suffered a catastrophic control failure. The P-40 was suddenly tumbling through the air where it had just been flying smoothly. But this was exactly what Wheeler had intended. As the P-40 completed its violent rotation, Wheeler neutralized the controls and pushed the stick forward. The aircraft was now pointed almost straight down, inverted, with the German formation directly ahead and slightly below his inverted position. Wheeler had converted a defensive glide into an offensive position in less than 3 seconds, using nothing but gravity and aerodynamics. Hartmann saw the American fighter's nose suddenly pointed directly at him and reacted with the instincts of an experienced pilot, braking hard left and diving. His wingman broke right. The remaining 4 German fighters scattered, each pilot making split-second decisions to avoid what appeared to be a head-on attack from an aircraft that had been completely vulnerable moments before. The formation cohesion dissolved instantly, each pilot thinking only of his own survival. Wheeler let the P-40 continue its dive, now right side up, after completing the barrel roll induced by his stall spin maneuver. He was accelerating rapidly in the dive, trading the altitude he had gained during his zoom climb for desperately needed airspeed. The German fighters were now scattered across several thousand feet of sky, their careful attack formation completely disrupted. And critically, they were now in front of him rather than behind. But Wheeler's Warhawk still had no power, and gravity was an asset that could only be spent once. He reached 15,000 feet in his dive, then 14, then 13. Building speed but losing altitude at an alarming rate, the scattered German fighters were beginning to regroup, the pilot's initial surprise giving way to tactical reassessment. Hartmann climbed back to altitude, calling his flight to reform. They had numbers and power. The American had nothing but momentum, and that was a temporary advantage at best. Wheeler knew he needed the engine. He had perhaps 30 seconds before the Messerschmitts regained positional advantage. His hands moved across the controls again, running through the restart procedure, but his mind was also working on the problem systematically. The engine had failed at full power during a climb. There had been no warning, no gradual decline. That suggested either fuel starvation or magneto failure. But he had already checked both. What else could cause instantaneous engine shutdown? Then it hit him. The P-40's Allison engine had a known issue with the fuel mixture control during rapid power changes at high altitude. If the mixture was too lean and the throttle was advanced too quickly, the engine could stumble or even quit completely. Wheeler had been at full power when he broke to intercept the German fighters. Then he had reduced power momentarily during his turn, then advanced to maximum power again. The rapid change at high altitude with a lean mixture might have caused exactly the kind of instantaneous shutdown he had experienced. Wheeler's hands moved to the mixture control, pushing it to full rich. Then to the primer pump, giving the engine several shots of raw fuel. Then he hit the starter. The propeller, which had been windmilling in the dive, jerked as the starter engaged. Once, twice. On the third rotation, the Allison caught, coughed, and roared to life. The sudden return of power was like a physical blow, the aircraft accelerating as the propeller bit into the air. Wheeler leveled off at 12,000 feet with full power restored, and 6 very confused German pilots trying to reorganize their attack. But the dynamics had changed completely. Wheeler's maneuver had not only disrupted their formation, but had also cost them altitude. They were now at roughly his altitude rather than holding the height advantage. And more importantly, Wheeler's violent defensive maneuver had burned itself into their tactical awareness. The American pilot was unpredictable and willing to do things that made no conventional sense. Hartmann led his flight back toward Wheeler, but there was now hesitation in the approach. The aggressive bounce had become a cautious engagement. 2 of the German pilots maintained high cover, while Hartmann and 3 others moved in for an attack. But they approached with spacing and caution, no longer assuming easy victory. Wheeler noted their formation and made his decision. He did not try to run. Instead, he turned directly toward them, throttle at maximum power, and as they began their attack runs, he did it again. Wheeler pulled the P-40 into another zoom climb, even more aggressive than the first. The Warhawk stood on its tail, burning speed for altitude. To the German pilots, it looked like the American was attempting the same maneuver, but Hartmann was ready this time. He pushed his own throttle forward, climbing to follow, determined not to be caught by the same trick twice. His wingman followed, both Messerschmitts climbing in pursuit of the zooming P-40. But Wheeler had refined his technique. This time, instead of holding the zoom until a complete stall, he rolled inverted at the top of the climb while he still had control authority, then pulled through into a split S, converting the vertical climb into a vertical dive in the opposite direction. The maneuver took him directly between 2 of the German fighters who had maintained their altitude, and the sudden reversal caught them completely unprepared. Wheeler dove through their formation, the P-40 accelerating wildly, and both German pilots broke away in opposite directions to avoid collision. Hartmann, who had climbed to follow Wheeler's zoom, found himself suddenly above and behind a diving target that was now moving away at high speed. The tactical geometry was terrible for an attack. He would have to dive to catch up, but by the time he could line up a shot, the American would be at very low altitude with significant speed advantage. Hartmann hesitated, his combat experience warring with his determination to down the enemy. In that moment of hesitation, Wheeler leveled out at 8,000 feet and turned hard back toward the remaining German fighters. What followed was not a traditional dogfight, but a chaotic running engagement, where Wheeler repeatedly used his stall zoom dive maneuver to disrupt German attacks and create impossible firing solutions. Each time the Messerschmitts tried to position for a conventional attack, Wheeler would climb steeply, stall or roll at the apex, and convert the climb into an aggressive dive or reversal. The German pilots, trained in conventional energy tactics, found themselves constantly wrong-footed. Every time they thought they understood where the American would be, he was somewhere else, using gravity and aerodynamics in ways that defied their tactical expectations. The engagement lasted 17 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat where most encounters were over in less than 5. During that time, Wheeler successfully defended himself against repeated attacks while gradually working his way west toward Allied lines. But the constant maneuvering was taking its toll. His fuel gauge showed less than 40 gallons remaining, and the Allison engine was running hot from sustained maximum power operation. More critically, his altitude was steadily decreasing. Each zoom climb traded speed for height, and each dive recovered speed but used up altitude. He was now operating between 7,000 and 3,000 feet, dangerously low for high-performance combat flying. What Wheeler did not know was that his radio calls, garbled by distance and interference, had been partially received by another flight of Tuskegee airmen returning from a separate mission. Captain Harold Johnson had caught fragments of transmissions indicating a pilot in trouble east of the Po River. Johnson had immediately altered course, bringing his flight of 4 P-40s toward Wheeler's position at maximum speed. They arrived at the engagement at 15:20 hours, just as Wheeler was completing yet another stall-induced reversal. The German pilots saw the 4 fresh American fighters approaching from the west and made the tactical decision to break off. Hartmann had expended most of his ammunition and fuel in the prolonged engagement, and his flight was now scattered across 10 miles of sky, trying to keep track of a single, wildly maneuvering enemy. The arrival of reinforcements tilted the odds decisively against them. Hartmann transmitted the order to disengage, and the 6 Messerschmitts turned east, climbing toward Germany. Johnson's flight formed up on Wheeler, who was now running on fumes with his fuel warning light glowing. Johnson's voice crackled over the radio, calm and professional. "Wheeler, what is your fuel state?" Wheeler checked his gauge and responded that he had less than 20 gallons remaining, perhaps 10 minutes of flight time. Johnson acknowledged and directed Wheeler to follow him to the emergency field at Pomigliano, 25 miles southwest. The flight of 5 P-40s turned west, leaving the combat area behind. Wheeler made it to Pomigliano with his fuel gauge reading 0, the Allison engine coughing as he turned onto final approach. He touched down and the engine quit before he could taxi off the runway, the P-40 rolling to a stop with completely dry tanks. Ground crew had to tow the aircraft off the runway. When Wheeler climbed out, his flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cold temperatures at altitude, and his hands were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. He had been in combat or under imminent threat for over 40 minutes. The interrogation following the mission was extensive. Intelligence officers wanted details of every aspect of the engagement. How many enemy aircraft? What marks and models? What were their tactics? When Wheeler described his stall-induced reversal maneuver, the interrogating officer, a Major Patterson who had flown combat missions in North Africa, stopped writing and looked up. "You deliberately stalled your aircraft in combat," Patterson said slowly, making sure he had heard correctly. "Multiple times, while being pursued by 6 enemy fighters." Wheeler nodded and explained the physics as he understood them, how the zoom climb converted speed to altitude, how the stall rotation changed his aspect to the attackers, how the subsequent dive recovered speed and created offensive opportunities. Patterson called in 2 other experienced pilots to hear Wheeler's explanation. The 3 men listened carefully, asking technical questions about control inputs, timing, and the P-40's behavior during the maneuver. When Wheeler finished, Patterson leaned back in his chair and was silent for a long moment. "Lieutenant," Patterson finally said, "that is either the craziest thing I have ever heard, or possibly the smartest. I honestly cannot tell which, but the fact that you are sitting here instead of being a prisoner or worse suggests it might be the latter." The intelligence officers spent the next 2 hours with Wheeler, documenting every detail of the engagement. They wanted to know exactly what control inputs he had used, how long each phase of the maneuver lasted, what the aircraft's attitude and airspeed were at each point, and how the German fighters had responded. Wheeler walked them through it repeatedly, using his hands to demonstrate aircraft positions and drawing diagrams on a blackboard to illustrate the geometry. The interrogation was recorded on a wire recorder, a device that captured voice on thin steel wire so that the information could be shared with training commands and tactical development units. One of the technical questions raised a critical point that Wheeler had not fully considered during the combat. Major Patterson asked whether the maneuver would work in all aircraft or only in the P-40 specifically. Wheeler thought carefully before answering. "The P-40 has relatively gentle stall characteristics," he explained. "When it stalls, it tends to mush and settle rather than snap, rolling violently. That made it possible to control the stall entry and recovery. An aircraft with more aggressive stall behavior might snap into an uncontrollable spin." Patterson noted this observation and underlined it in his notes. "This may be a technique that works only with certain aircraft types," he said. "That is important information for any tactical bulletin." The intelligence report from Wheeler's mission was forwarded up the chain of command, reaching 15th Air Force headquarters within 48 hours. The report included not just Wheeler's account, but also Captain Johnson's observations and the assessments from the debriefing officers. Within a week, copies had been distributed to tactical development sections at training commands in the United States. Within 2 weeks, test pilots at Wright Field in Ohio were conducting experiments with P-40s to understand the maneuver's mechanics and limitations. The experimental test flights revealed several important details. First, the maneuver required significant altitude to execute safely. A pilot needed at least 5,000 feet of altitude cushion to recover if something went wrong. Second, The technique worked best in aircraft, with docile stall characteristics and good control authority at low speeds. Third, the timing was critical. The stall had to be entered at precisely the right moment to achieve the desired result. Too early, and the pursuing fighters would simply wait for the recovery. Too late, and the aircraft might not have sufficient altitude or airspeed to complete the maneuver safely. Fourth, the maneuver was extremely disorienting and required strong situational awareness to execute while under attack. Test pilots reported difficulty maintaining track of enemy positions during the violent rotation. The test program also explored variations of the basic maneuver. Pilots experimented with rolling during the zoom climb to change the axis of rotation. They tried different rates of pull into the stall. They tested the technique at various altitudes and airspeeds. Some variations proved more effective than others. One particularly useful variation involved a barrel roll during the zoom climb, which allowed the pilot to keep visual contact with pursuing enemies while still achieving the vertical displacement. Another variation used asymmetric rudder input during the stall to create a flat spin rather than a nose-down dive, which could work in specific tactical situations. By early May 1944, the test program had generated sufficient data for a formal tactical bulletin. The document, designated TB-44-37 and titled Defensive Maneuvers Against Multiple Attackers, described the stall zoom reversal as a viable defensive option in specific circumstances. The bulletin was distributed to all fighter squadrons in the European Theatre of Operations and the Mediterranean Theatre of Operations. It was also included in the curriculum at advanced fighter training schools in the United States. The bulletin was careful to note the requirements, including precise throttle and stick control, thorough understanding of stall characteristics, and sufficient altitude to recover from uncommanded departures from controlled flight. It was recommended only for experienced pilots in desperate situations. Word of Wheeler's engagement spread through the squadron within hours. Captain Johnson, who had witnessed the final minutes of the combat, described what he had seen to the other pilots. An enemy fighter would be positioned perfectly for a shot, Johnson said, and then Wheeler would pull straight up, and the whole geometry would just fall apart. The German pilot would be left trying to figure out where his target went, while Wheeler was diving back through the formation from a completely different angle. I have never seen anything like it. Over the following weeks, several Tuskegee pilots experimented with Wheeler's technique during training flights. The maneuver was dangerous, requiring precise timing and intimate knowledge of the aircraft's stall characteristics. Done incorrectly, it could easily result in a flat spin or structural failure from excessive G-forces. But done properly, it offered a defensive option that was nearly impossible to counter without prior knowledge. The key was the aggressive zoom climb that appeared to be a mistake, followed by the stall rotation that seemed like loss of control but was actually a planned reversal. Lieutenant Robert Price, one of the squadron's most experienced pilots, flew with Wheeler to study the maneuver firsthand. After the flight, Price reported that the technique worked because it violated fundamental energy management principles that all fighter pilots were taught. Conventional tactics said never trade speed for altitude without a plan to recover it. Never stall in combat. Never give up offensive position once you have it. Wheeler's maneuver deliberately did all three things, but combined them in a way that turned liabilities into assets. The United States Army Air Forces officially documented the technique in May 1944 in a tactical bulletin designated TB-44-37, titled Defensive Maneuvers Against Multiple Attackers. The bulletin described the stall zoom reversal as a viable defensive option in specific circumstances, particularly when confronted by superior numbers without altitude advantage. The bulletin was careful to note the requirements: precise throttle and stick control, thorough understanding of stall characteristics, and sufficient altitude to recover from uncommanded departures from controlled flight. It was recommended only for experienced pilots in desperate situations. What the official bulletin did not mention was that the technique had been discovered by accident by a 23-year-old African-American pilot who had been forced to attend a segregated training program that demanded excellence to overcome prejudice. Wheeler's mechanical engineering background and the exhaustive technical training at Tuskegee had given him the knowledge to understand what was happening to his aircraft during a crisis. His desperation had given him the willingness to try something that conventional wisdom said was impossible. By autumn of 1944, variations of Wheeler's maneuver were being used by American fighter pilots across the European and Pacific theaters. The technique was particularly effective against Japanese fighters, which typically held performance advantages in climb and maneuverability, but were less effective in high-speed dives. United States Navy pilots operating from carriers in the Pacific developed their own variation, using the stall reversal to break enemy attacks against slower, less maneuverable torpedo bombers and dive bombers. The German Luftwaffe also studied the technique, largely because Oberleutnant Hartmann filed a detailed combat report describing his engagement with the American pilot over Italy. Hartmann's report noted the Americans' use of vertical maneuvers to disrupt formation attacks, and recommended that pilots be briefed on the possibility of such tactics. German test pilots at the Erprobungsstelle facility at Rechlin conducted experiments with captured Allied aircraft and determined that the maneuver was most effective with aircraft that had relatively docile stall characteristics, like the P-40 and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. German fighters, optimized for speed and climb performance, tended to have more aggressive stall behavior that made controlled recovery more difficult. Wheeler himself flew 68 combat missions by the end of the European War in May 1945. He was credited with 3 confirmed aerial victories and 7 probable victories, a solid record though not exceptional by the standards of leading aces, but his contribution to tactical aviation went far beyond his personal combat score. The defensive technique he discovered was still being taught at the United States Air Force Fighter Weapons School decades later, though by then few instructors knew the origin story. The maneuver had become simply part of the canon of aerial combat tactics, another tool in the fighter pilot's repertoire. After the war, Wheeler returned to Georgia with a Distinguished Flying Cross, an air medal with 4 oak leaf clusters, and credit for pioneering a combat maneuver. He used his military benefits to attend graduate school at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, earning a master's degree in aeronautical engineering. He went to work for Lockheed Aircraft Corporation in California, where he contributed to the design of several high-performance aircraft during the 1950s and 60s. His colleagues at Lockheed knew he had been a Tuskegee Airman, but were generally unaware of his specific wartime contributions. The irony was not lost on Wheeler. He had fought for a nation that systematically discriminated against people who looked like him. He had trained at a segregated facility specifically created because the military did not believe African Americans should fly alongside white pilots. He had proven his capability and his courage in combat, then returned to a country where he could not eat at certain restaurants or stay at certain hotels because of his skin color. The heroism displayed in the skies over Europe did not translate to equality at home. But Wheeler never expressed bitterness about these contradictions. In interviews later in life, he emphasized instead the opportunity that military service had provided. "Tuskegee gave me wings," he said in a 1983 oral history interview. "Not just the wings on my uniform, but the knowledge and confidence to know I could compete with anyone on equal terms if given the chance. The segregation was wrong, the discrimination was wrong, but the training was superb. They made us better than we needed to be, and that served us well." The broader significance of the Tuskegee Airmen extended far beyond individual combat achievements or tactical innovations. The program demonstrated conclusively that African American pilots could perform at the highest levels of military aviation, a fact that had been disputed by military leadership before the war. The success of the Tuskegee Airmen provided crucial evidence in the arguments for military desegregation, which President Harry Truman ordered in 1948 through Executive Order 9814. Wheeler's maneuver, discovered in desperation over Italy, became part of that larger story of capability proven against prejudice. The tactical principles underlying Wheeler's technique remained relevant through subsequent generations of aerial combat. During the Korean War, United States Air Force pilots flying against Soviet-built MiG-15 fighters often found themselves outclassed in speed and climb rate. The vertical reversal maneuver, now well established in American fighter tactics, provided a defensive option that exploited the American pilot's superior training and aircraft ruggedness. Captain James Jabara, who became the first jet ace in history during the Korean War, specifically cited vertical maneuvers, including the stall reversal, as key elements of his defensive tactics. By the Vietnam War era, the evolution of jet fighters and the development of air-to-air missiles had changed the nature of aerial combat. The close-range dogfights that characterized World War II became less common as pilots engaged at longer ranges with guided weapons. But the fundamental principles of energy management, vertical maneuvering, and using an aircraft's specific strengths against an enemy's weaknesses remained central to fighter tactics. The United States Navy's Top Gun program, established in 1969 to improve fighter pilot performance, included extensive training in vertical fight techniques descended directly from innovations like Wheeler's wartime discovery. Modern fighter aircraft, with their sophisticated fly-by-wire control systems and thrust vectoring engines, can execute maneuvers that would have been impossible in World War II-era fighters. Post-stall maneuvers like the Pugachev Cobra and the Herbst maneuver deliberately use stall and thrust vectoring to achieve radical changes in aircraft attitude and velocity. These modern techniques are technological descendants of the simple aerodynamic principle Wheeler discovered over Italy in 1944, that an aircraft in a controlled departure from normal flight can achieve positions and aspects unavailable through conventional maneuvering. Wheeler retired from Lockheed in 1986 after 41 years in aviation, spanning combat flying, flight test work, and aeronautical engineering. He had contributed to projects ranging from the F-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, to the C-5 Galaxy heavy transport. He held 17 patents related to high-speed aerodynamics and control systems. His professional achievements were substantial by any measure, but he remained most proud of his service with the Tuskegee Airmen. In 2006, at age 85, Wheeler was invited to speak at the United States Air Force Fighter Weapons School at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. The commandant of the school, a brigadier general who had flown F-15 Eagles in the First Gulf War, wanted Wheeler to meet the current generation of fighter pilots being trained there. Wheeler toured the facilities, so vastly advanced from the primitive conditions at Tuskegee 6 decades earlier, and watched young pilots practice aerial combat in multi-million-dollar simulators. During the question period after his talk, a young captain asked Wheeler if he had been scared during the engagement over Italy when his engine quit. Wheeler paused before answering, considering the question carefully. "I was terrified," he finally said, "but I was also trained. Fear is just another variable you have to account for, like fuel state or ammunition count. You acknowledge it, you manage it, and you do what needs to be done. The training at Tuskegee taught us that we could not afford to let fear or prejudice or any other obstacle prevent us from executing our mission. That lesson served me well that day over Italy and every day since. The recognition of Tuskegee Airmen contributions continued to grow in the decades after World War II. In 1995, the United States Air Force officially recognized the Tuskegee Airmen with a ceremony at the Pentagon, acknowledging their role in military aviation history. In 2007, the Tuskegee Airmen collectively received the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian award given by the United States Congress. President George W. Bush presented the medal to 300 surviving Tuskegee Airmen, including Wheeler, in a ceremony at the Capitol Rotunda. Wheeler's personal story became better known following publication of his autobiography in 2009, titled Against the Wind. The book detailed his experiences at Tuskegee, his combat service, and his post-war career in aviation. The chapter describing the March 1944 engagement over Italy was titled "The Day I Forgot How to Fly," a reference to his decision to deliberately violate every principle of conventional flying in order to survive. The book became required reading for some military history courses and helped document the tactical innovations developed by Tuskegee Airmen. Marcus Wheeler passed away in January 2012 at the age of 90. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery was attended by over 400 people, including 3 retired generals, dozens of fellow Tuskegee Airmen, and numerous colleagues from his aerospace engineering career. The United States Air Force sent a flight of 4 F-22 Raptors to perform a missing man formation flyover, the newest and most advanced fighters, honoring a man who had flown one of the last generation of piston-engine combat aircraft. The tactical maneuver Wheeler discovered that March Day over Italy has no official name in modern fighter tactics doctrine. It is simply described as a vertical reversal with stall entry, one option among many in the complex calculus of aerial combat. But its influence on fighter tactics development was substantial, demonstrating that unconventional approaches could succeed where conventional tactics failed. Wheeler's willingness to attempt something that seemed impossible, driven by necessity and enabled by exceptional training, exemplified the broader story of the Tuskegee Airmen proving capability through performance. The legacy of that moment extends beyond aviation tactics to questions of opportunity, excellence, and the consequences of discrimination. Wheeler succeeded not despite his Tuskegee training, but because of it. The segregated program, created from prejudice, had paradoxically provided more thorough preparation than many standard training pipelines. The need to be exceptional to overcome prejudice had created pilots who understood their aircraft at a deeper level than merely operating them. This exhaustive preparation gave Wheeler the knowledge foundation to improvise successfully when conventional options failed. The broader lesson, which Wheeler himself articulated in numerous post-war speeches and interviews, was that limiting opportunity based on irrelevant characteristics like race or ethnicity was not just morally wrong, but pragmatically foolish. How many other innovations have been lost? Wheeler asked in a 2003 speech at his alma mater, Morehouse College, because potential contributors were excluded from participation. How much human potential has been wasted by societies that restricted access based on arbitrary classifications rather than ability and effort? The Tuskegee experience proved that excellence emerges when opportunity is provided and standards are maintained. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.